Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to go through the process I use to make an old school dungeon. The approach I'm going to cover, it's for a good sized level, like 20 to 30 rooms, something that could be a single level in a multi-level mega dungeon or piece of a larger dungeon. Making dungeons is one of the best parts of being a referee. It's fun. It's a chance to be creative. We get to be our own game designers. I'm pumped for this one. Let's go. I'm John. I'm an old-time referee. I talk about running old school Dungeons and Dragons here, as well as Shadow Dark, a modern game that plays like an old school game. Thanks for being here. The approach I'm going to cover is top-down. Start with a concept, a little bit of history. I frame some neighborhoods and factions, map it, stock it, add wandering monsters, then decide if there's any kind of special rules required by the concept. I'll describe the framework and then we'll dive into a practical example from my homebrew campaign. So the first thing is, what do I mean by top-down versus bottoms-up, if you've never encountered those terms? I spent a lot of my early career as a project manager. I think it either came out of project management or budgeting and planning. But the idea is that top-down says, you're going to create some kind of a framework first, a roadmap, almost like an architecture. And bottoms-up would say, no, let's just go right into the details. And when we accumulate all the details, then we'll know what the big picture looks like. So in budgeting, maybe you've got a budget, like how much are we going to spend on applications, infrastructure, cybersecurity, et cetera, in an IT framework. And then you make the details fit how much you've allocated. Bottoms up budgeting would say, no, let's figure out what we want to spend at the very detailed level, roll it up, and then see what the big category is. Most advice on getting started as a referee is very much bottoms up. Like, create a village for yourself, for your players, for the first game session, put a few things in there for them to do, place to buy some gear, meet in a tavern, have a single dungeon outside of town. Don't worry about the big picture, the cosmos, the kingdoms, your campaign world. Just build on that incrementally and let the world take shape. I don't know if it's a character flaw or just how my brain works, but I always have to start with a plan. So I start everything a little bit top down, and you'll see that in this dungeon framework. So from a concept, it's pretty simple. Hey, what's your dungeon about? Like, what kind of ruin is it? Is it a tomb? Is it mines? Is it an old ruined city? A former wizard's lair? I try to think a little bit about the history, and then what are the dominant monsters going to be? And we'll talk about factions and neighborhoods a little bit more detailed in a second. From a history perspective, there's a seminal article in Dragon Magazine, and I'll link to this one down below. You can read it on the Internet Archive. Showed up in Dragon 10, and then I know it's reprinted in the Best of Dragon. It was called Let There Be a Method to Your Madness. And the idea was, when you're creating a dungeon, think about who the designer was, why they put all this effort in to build a dungeon, what the different levels represented to them, maybe even what a lot of the rooms were. Now, none of this is going to matter to the players. You have to imagine that the dungeon's been abandoned for decades, centuries, even thousands of years. But for you as the creator, it'll help you with the creation of the dungeon. So I've always used this rational approach. Probably 75 or 80% of the dungeons I make start with this sort of rational mindset. There's another camp in the OSR for sure that says, no, dungeons are part of the mythical underworld. The dungeon should be kind of a gonzo fun house with weird, mad stuff around every corner. I find that style is a great change of pace. I can't do it all the time. So the next topic is to think about the factions in the dungeon and then what kind of neighborhoods that creates. I typically want at least 2 or 3 different factions in every dungeon, and I want the map to have loops and multiple paths, ways to go up and down on every level. This invites exploration. The players aren't following a story, they're going to meander through the level. And neighborhoods really help me picture, like mentally, the dungeon and create a feeling for what it's going to be like to explore that space. I'll give you an example from one of my home games. So there's this dungeon where the level below it is warm and humid, and the outside world is cold and frozen. And there's some areas in this dungeon where those two meet. And so the dungeon, this one neighborhood's completely full of mist and fog. It's very claustrophobic. There's no vision. When the players get close to the walls are covered with tribal artwork and graffiti. It's all been put there by these giant 8-foot tall muscular ogre creatures. It creates a creepy vibe. You can't see anything. You can't see the walls because of all the fog. But when you do get close to the walls, you realize that they're all covered with this tribal artwork that's really high. So when I talk about like how a neighborhood gives your dungeon a certain vibe, that's what I'm talking about. Let's apply these principles to an example from my home campaign. I've been converting a homebrew to Shadowdark this past year, so I have something unique to run at convention games. It's a game I used to call the Black City. The elevator pitch for it is that aliens invaded our world from another dimension or from space. They've built a research outpost in the frozen north to conduct their terrible sorceries. They're gone, but the elder evil that they summoned and that wiped them all out is still in the ruins sleeping. And now the ruined city has been discovered by waves of different explorers. The Atlanteans found it, the Hyperboreans, your world's equivalent of the Romans, and now the Northmen. And you can find evidence of all these other people in the ruins. And at the time of the campaign, Vikings are pointing the prows of their ships north to the island of Thule, and they spend the spring and the summer exploring the ruins for like rare artifact and jeweled treasures. And they even have a rudimentary trade town on the beach with some frontier law and order. So that would be the concept. I've talked a little bit about both the concept and history there. The specific level we're going to talk about, underneath the city, there's these giant subway tunnels, transit tunnels that connect different dungeons underneath the city. There's like 12 different dungeons under there, a combination of small and large. And then the first one that we'll talk about here in the ancient past was used for sort of logistics and transportation purposes, but that's been lost to the mists of time. The first dungeon is called the Well of Woe. It's a big hole on the outskirts of the city, like a lipped hole, like a well, that leads down to the beginning of these transit tunnels and the first level. One of my buddies did some concept art back in the day because he's an artist and he thought this place was awesome. Nowadays, there's like an outpost from the Jarl there. They have rope ladders that'll help people get down into the dungeon for a small fee. And so the concept for this particular level, like when we're thinking about neighborhoods and stuff like that, it's fairly well traveled. People go through there from time to time. So there aren't permanent layers. Monsters would have been wiped out a long time ago. Instead, the kind of things you're going to run into there are either transients or scavengers, opportunists, or predators. One of the special themes for the level, there's a treasure you can find that's only recoverable through persistence and crafty play. And then there's a lingering spirit from the ancient world there that can be both an ally and quest giver. And I try to think about each of these things in like, I don't know, 2 or 3 sentences. Again, like an elevator pitch. What's the overall dungeon? What's the history? What's this particular level about? In terms of neighborhoods for this kind of a dungeon, so there's some bandits. Frost gremlins are like my campaign's equivalent to kobolds or goblins, those small scurrying humanoids that you frequently see in low-level dungeons. The frost gremlins are not native to this level. They search all through the transit tunnels, carrying little rat cages to capture rats. They actually have an ichor pool where if they dunk the rats, they'll turn into other frost gremlins. Very 1980s. And then there's these opportunistic predators called the boogeymen. They're like mutated humans who have become big, 8 foot, 7 foot tall, muscular cannibals. And then the final neighborhood is the restricted zone, which is all sorts of traps and guardians. When I start a map, I don't even get out the graph paper. The first several iterations of a map are all just on throwaway printer paper with a pencil, where I'm just basically drawing shapes to get a sense of, hey, what is the overall flow of this dungeon? How do I see different neighborhoods connecting? What are the connections between different parts of the dungeon? This style of drawing helps you make sure that you have enough loops. You can get freely around from neighborhood to neighborhood, that there's choke points where you want them. You're thinking in terms of entrances and exits. Once I'm happy with the nodes and the flow of the dungeon, I'll go and create a graph paper version. This is the finished graph paper version of the Well of Woe. And then once I'm happy with the pencil version, it's ready for prime time. I'll go and create a computerized version of the map. This is the final copy. This one was done with Campaign Cartographer. Next up are the neighborhoods. So the brown neighborhood in the upper left corner, those are the bandits. And these guys are just other Vikings or Norse that have decided that going deep into a dungeon filled with cannibal monsters and undead seems dangerous. Maybe we should just lure other Vikings into a sense of security and murder them and take their treasure when they're all weak and depleted and loaded with wealth. So they're really evil. The blue area are where the frost gremlins are looking for rats, and the red is the hunting grounds for the boogeymen. That purple area is the restricted zone at the bottom of the map, and it creates some choke points. And the green arrow is interesting. I like to come up with some kind of a shtick or overall concept for a level that makes it interesting. For this one, it was the idea that there's a wall, and the players might notice that it's not stone. It's just actually crusted with grime and dust and 1,000 years of dirt. And if they scrape it or somehow wipe the stuff off of the surface, they realize that it's a really thick piece of glass they can look through to a room that's over and down, where there's kind of a green glow down there. They can see treasure. They can see dozens of dead Roman skeletons. Obviously, they're dead. They're skeletons. I love that motif from video games where you see someplace special right from the beginning or very early on, but you don't know how to get there, and it becomes its own kind of quest. And that's a good piece of advice, I think, for level design in general. You want to have several plot hooks that get people into the dungeon that are more external. Then once they're in the dungeon, the discovery of it and the exploration of the level itself should naturally create further plot hooks that drive the players to interact further. And in this example, if they happen to find that room and wipe off the glass, then they'll have an opportunity to find a treasure that no one else has found. I also mentioned that a level should have multiple ways in and out. So the blue arrows are all entrances from the surface. You've got the Well of Woe entrance at Area 1 at the top of the map. That's the connection to the transit tunnels that will take you miles under the city and connect to the other dungeons. In fact, there's no reason the players have to start with this dungeon in this particular campaign. They could wander the city, find a different dungeon underneath the city, connect to the tunnels, and actually find this particular dungeon from the north. And then a couple blocks over from where the Well of Woe is, there's a building with a cellar and another hole down. That entrance, unfortunately, puts anyone right into the heart of the hunting ground, so not necessarily the safest entrance. And the red arrow actually is a way down to level 2. It's not depicted on this map, but underneath that tunnel, there's a secondary access tunnel beneath it. And in that access tunnel, there's a chute that can drop characters down to level 2. That's not the best way you want to get deeper into the dungeon because it's usually a one-way trip. And then it's very dangerous trying to fight your way back up to level 1 and then eventually out of the dungeon. It was a very common trope in old school dungeons, like slides and chutes that put you deeper into the dungeon. In the Black City, there's much easier ways to get down. Once you have your map, it's time to think about stocking. That little image comes from this book, the 1981 Basic Set, which has 3 or 4 excellent pages on how to stock a dungeon. It feels to me like dungeon building advice has just gotten progressively worse in Dungeons and Dragons in the succeeding 40 years, where I don't even think 5th edition had anything on how to build a dungeon. The advice probably reached its high point in this basic book. I'll put a link to it down below. But that table, I think of it like the golden ratio, and I've kept it with me through my entire referee career. Let's take a simple look at how it would play out if a dungeon had 24 rooms. So you can see like about a third of the rooms are going to have monsters, an average of 8. Could be more, could be less, but that gives you a rough ballpark for what you should be shooting for. About half those monster rooms will have treasure. Then there'll be 1/6 of the dungeon will have traps, some with treasure, some without. Specials are those weird or interesting rooms that are not quite a monster or a trap. Some examples here in the Well of Woe. Finding the ancient spirit that can act as an ally or quest giver as a special. There's also a room where the players might be able to activate a portal that lets them teleport somewhere else. Those would be examples of specials. And then about a third of the dungeon is empty rooms, and some of those empty rooms should even have treasures in them. Now, there should be no such thing as an empty room in your dungeon. So empty just means it doesn't have a monster, trap, or special. But there absolutely should be interesting things in the room and things that the players can explore and interact with. So some examples here for the Well of Woe of like, okay, what's an empty room? In the entrance areas, maybe there's remains of camps where other adventuring parties have set up a little base of operations. Players can root around the debris. Maybe they find an unused torch that they can add to their inventory. Or some of those entry rooms have graffiti on the walls. People have like carved or chalk stuff or used charcoal to write things that end up being like dungeon rumors or Norse wisdom. A cleaved head no longer plots, something like that. I think even one of the rooms has like a wooden godhead figure that someone dragged down into the dungeon and put there as a little shrine to Thor or Odin. So even though the room's empty doesn't mean that there's not something fun that the players can do when they find it. Creating a wandering monster table is next. The reason I have this up, so I don't like wandering monster tables that are just 1d6 zombies or 1d4 ghouls. I feel like you should create an encounter out of each wandering monster. That way in the moment, you know exactly how you want to play it. It's more interesting than you just trying to improvise out of the blue if you have the time. So here, for instance, we've got some singing frost gremlins. Genganger are like the ghouls of the dungeon, very Evil Dead inspired. If someone dies in the dungeons, there's a chance that their body immediately becomes inhabited by an evil spirit that reanimates them as an undead, and they become a Genganger. And then the boogeymen, those are those big cannibal mutates we've talked about that prowl the hunting ground. And then think about what kind of special rules or conditions apply to the whole dungeon. Some examples I've used. So here in the Well of Woe, there's different magic doors and crystals that will cause the doors to open. One of the dungeons in the transit tunnels is home to an ancient white dragon that's hibernating. It radiates extreme cold, so it's frozen in ice, and its treasure is cased in ice, and there's stalactites and stalagmites warning it off from the rest of the dungeon. But can the players explore in and around without waking it up? If they're really brave, could they squeeze through some of the bars of its cage, so to speak, and loot the dragon horde without waking it up? Very inspired by The Hobbit, except placed in the frozen north. That'd be an example of where I've put a whole bunch of special rules up there. The saltpox one I love. There's this crystal entity in one of the dungeons. It's infectious. Creatures that get infected by the crystals, which the Vikings on the beach, they call it saltpox, slowly become zombies, like part of this crystal collective, and they're infectious, and it's horrifying. So imagine a swarm of infected rats with like crystals sticking out of their heads and white eyes because they're zombie rats. But every bite has a chance of infecting you with saltpox, or running into like a big infected polar bear, which is a horrifying monster with crystals sticking out of its body. Thinking about your dungeon that way, like what kind of special rules or conditions? First off, it's a chance for you to be creative, but then really make that particular level distinctive and fun. Hey, I hope this was helpful. Maybe it's inspired you to start creating your own dungeon. I like to start top down, think a little bit about the concept, like what's this dungeon about? Then what's the history? What's the background for this particular level? What kind of factions are going to be there? And then once I start thinking about the neighborhoods, that's kind of when the creative juices really get moving. Map it. Don't go to graph paper so fast. Think about kind of the nodes and the flow first, and then map it in great detail. Stock it. Tom Moldvay, Basic D&D, really set the standard for dungeon stocking. Create your wandering monsters, and then think about whether there's any kind of special rules or conditions that affect this dungeon. I know someone's going to ask, yes, I'm assembling that Black City dungeon so it can be published and shared. All my kids went to college this year for the first time, like this fall. They're all out of the house. Yay. So I have time to do things like make a YouTube channel or try to write for publication. Thanks for being here. You're awesome. If you made it this far, please consider subscribing. I'll see everyone next time.